Good afternoon. My name is Michael Lind, and I'm Policy Director of the Economic Growth Program and the Next Social Contract Initiative at the New America Foundation. On behalf of the Rockefeller Foundation and New America, I'd like to welcome you to today's launch of an important new study, Standing on Shaky Ground, Americans' Experience with Economic Insecurity, written by Jacob Hacker, Philip Rame, and Mark Schlesinger. This report is the first study to detail how economic insecurity affects the well-being of Americans, based on a new two-wave survey of Americans that examines their experiences and perceptions between March 2008 and September 2009. Standing on Shaky Ground is a follow-up to a pioneering study of July 2010, also supported by the Rockefeller Foundation, that proposed a new Economic Security Index, or ESI. The ESI demonstrated that economic insecurity for American families in 2009 and 2010 was greater than at any time on record, with approximately 1 in 5 Americans experiencing a 25% or greater decline in available household income. Standing on Shaky Ground builds on the earlier report on the Economic Security Index by detailing the ways in which insecurity is experienced by Americans in 4 distinct domains of economic life: employment, medical spending, family needs, and wealth. In light of the suffering produced by today's Great Recession, this groundbreaking study is as timely as it is relevant. Today's event will proceed as follows. The authors of the report, Jacob Hacker and Mark Schlesinger, will discuss their findings. Then James Fallows, national correspondent for The Atlantic and former chairman of the board of the New America Foundation, of which he is still a board member, will moderate a panel discussion among Stuart Butler of the Heritage Foundation, Ezra Klein of the Washington Post, and Lawrence Michel of the Economic Policy Institute. If time permits, a question and answer session will follow. And please take a moment to turn off your cell phones. We'd be very grateful for that. It's a real pleasure to introduce Jacob Hacker, whom many of you know as the author of a 2007 proposal for universal health care for America, that became a template for several presidential aspirants' plans and the public option that was debated last year. Professor Hacker received his BA from Harvard in 1994 and his PhD from Yale in 2000. Currently, he is the Stanley B. Razor Professor of Political Science at Yale University and a resident fellow at the Institution for Social and Policy Studies. He has also been a fellow at the New America Foundation from the beginning of our organization and a former junior fellow of the Harvard Society of Fellows. Jacob Hacker's most recent book, co-authored with Paul Pierson, is Winner-Take-All Politics, a study of inequality in politics in America. His other books are The Great Risk Shift, The New Economic Insecurity and the Decline of the American Dream in 2006, The Divided Welfare State, The Battle Over Public and Private Social Benefits in the United States, published in 2002, and The Road to Nowhere, The Genesis of President Clinton's Plan for Health Security, published in 1997. He is also the co-author with Paul Pierson of Off-Center, The Republican Revolution and the Erosion of American Democracy, published in 2005, and has edited 2 volumes, most recently Health at Risk, America's Ailing Health System and How to Heal It, in 2008. He oversees a Social Science Research Council project on the privatization of risk, and is vice president of the National Academy of Social Insurance. Please join me in welcoming Jacob Hacker.
Well, thanks, Mike, and thank you all for coming. And it's a huge pleasure to be here. And I'm in the unusual position of actually getting up here and handing off the microphone, so to speak, to Mark. And Mark Schlesinger is our resident survey expert on the Economic Security Index team, and he's going to be the one who presents the main findings that are detailed in your in the reports that I hope you had a chance to glance at when you came in. Now, to keep it brief, I'm going to have to play against type, the type of professors that is. So you probably heard the joke that professors can speak for 5 minutes and 5 hours and say exactly the same thing. I've heard another version of this, which is that politicians are the only folks who can speak for 5 minutes in 5 hours, or 5 hours and say exactly nothing. So at least we're doing a little bit better. And I want to use my 5 minutes mostly to offer thanks. Thanks first to the people who made this report possible. Mark Schlesinger, of course, but also Philip Ream, a political scientist at Ohio State University, a member of our team who's here today. Greg Huber, another political scientist, wasn't able to make the trip, but I'm happy to report that in the audience is a new member of our team, Austin Nichols of the Urban Institute, and Austin will be taking the reins from Rob Valletta of the San Francisco Federal Reserve. Rob, for those who attended the launch event of the Economic Security Index, is our resident SIP expert. I called him Sipperman. The SIP is the Survey of Income and Program Participation. And Austin is very much ready to become, I don't know, super boy. As you'll notice, he's quite young, and pick up where Rob left off. A few of the people who made this report possible are not able to be here. Victoria Bilski, our sterling administrative director of the Economic Security Index, is recovering from a bout of serious depression caused by reading the report several times. Also making this event possible are Aaron Rosenberg of Rational 360, the amazing NAF team, including Kate Brown and Stephanie Gunter. And I just want to offer a very deep thanks to the New America Foundation. I think this is the third event I've done here in about 4 months, which is pushing my luck, even given my longstanding connection to the New America Foundation. And it feels really like a reunion to have Jim here at the New America Foundation, because Jim and I both go back a long way with the foundation, and I'm very honored that Jim would agree to moderate this event. I'm going to only introduce Jim in the briefest possible way by saying that he is an amazing writer and thinker, and his recent essay, Can America Rise Again, in the Atlantic Monthly is destined to win some kind of award, I hope. He has won the National Magazine Award, the Emmy, the American Book Award. I'm not making the Emmy up. And I am going to say that he also won the Oscar recently for his role in, no, that one I made up. But he did win an Emmy, actually, for a documentary series, Doing Business in China. And he is going to be overseeing a wonderful panel that includes a member of our advisory board. And just for those who are interested, you can look at the inside cover of the report. It lists our full advisory board, which is a sterling group of economic experts. One member of our advisory board, Larry Michel of the Economic Policy Institute. We also have the indispensable Ezra Klein of the Washington Post, and Stuart Butler, who is indispensable as well, of the Heritage Foundation here today. Stuart and I seem to appear a lot together at events representing disparate points of view. I'm going to leave you to guess which sides of the political spectrum we're supposed to represent. And then lastly, I want to just say that I'm really grateful to all of you for coming. Okay, now I've used up all my 5 minutes, and I do actually have a little bit additional to say. And I want to just situate what we're doing within the larger Economic Security Index project. And there's two parts to that. Part one is just to tell you what the Economic Security Index is. And fortunately, Mike more or less delivered that in his opening. It's a measure of the share of Americans who experience a 25% or greater decline in what we call their available household resources, mainly their income minus their medical costs and debt service, and who don't have an adequate financial safety net. So it's basically a share of people who experience year-to-year large economic losses. And if you look here, you can see that that number has risen over the period that we're able to look at using the Survey of Income and Program Participation. We have to project the most recent years pending the release of the new Survey of Income, Program, and Participation data. But one thing I will note is we were able to check our projections against the survey that Mark is going to be talking about in a moment, and found that our estimates based on historical trends are very close to what we were able to find using actual survey results from people in 2009. The trend, even if you exclude those projected years, is upward. And this is important, I think, in thinking about the implications of our findings. One of the points that Mark will bring out is that how we view the experiences of this deep downturn depend on part on what we expect to happen in future years. And each recession across the last 2 recessions that we have in our data set has been accompanied by a decline in economic insecurity after the downturn, but one that doesn't bring us back to prior levels of economic security. And given the slow recovery that we're experiencing now, I think the expectation is even stronger that we're going to continue to see the same kinds of insecurities that we find in our survey results for 2008 and 2009 going forward. Going forward, we will be doing a series of reports, not only updating the index to reflect newly available data, but also doing a series of what we call supplemental reports, looking at key features of the index. We're going to look at medical care, at wealth, at the causes of large income declines, and we'll also do a cross-national analysis looking at the United States compared with other rich countries. And the next report we'll release will actually look at demographic differences across the population, and you'll see that those differences are very much evident in the survey results that Mark will be presenting. And with that, I hand things off to Mark. And in fact, I will probably, I'm going to sit down. I don't want to be
Thank you, Jacob. I promise up front to offer nicknames for no one and to try to protect Austin from Jacob's urge to do the same as much as possible. Were our message today to be that in the worst economic downturn in a century, that Americans were feeling some economic uncertainty, it wouldn't be particularly newsworthy, nor would we be all gathered here today. Our effort in this report is to probe past those self-evident economic truths that in hard times households are economically insecure, and to look more deeply at the ways in which economic insecurity touch Americans' lives more deeply, more broadly, and in a way more lastingly impactful than have been recognized in past academic treatments or in policy discourse. Now, from the get-go, it's important to recognize, assuming I can figure out how to use Jacob's clever PowerPoint tools here, it's important to recognize that Americans' worry about economic conditions are not a product of the current economic downturn. To be sure, when the unemployment rate doubled, the proportion of Americans saying they were worried about losing their job went up proportionately. But for most types of economic risks, ranging from housing to medical care to a set of other conditions that we don't have on this particular graph, there is lots of data from tracking polls over time to show that even though those risks, those worries were exacerbated by the economic downturn, the so-called Great Recession, that high levels of worry are existing, persistent characteristics of American life. The Survey of Economic Risk Perceptions and Insecurity, or SERPI, in our appeal to the Harry Potter fans in the crowd, is designed to reach past what we know from those existing prior surveys, and to do so by going beyond measures of worry as a way to assess the prevalence and consequences of economic instability. The survey does that by enumerating the various types of economic shocks that people have actually experienced in their lives, by trying to assess the impact of those shocks on Americans' psychological and physical well-being, and to assess the capacity of the buffers of Americans' household to cushion those shocks when they occur. The survey itself, and we'll spend little time on the details, so they're expanded somewhat in the report, was fielded in 2 different waves as part of the American National Election Study 2008-2009 panel study. We were in the field in March and September of 2009. Roughly 2,500 respondents in March, 2,200 in September, This is a panel study, so you're trying to get the same people to answer multiple waves. We were successful with about 2,000 people. So most of the results today are presented based on a sample of 2,000. Obviously, there's some attrition from wave to wave, and with matching across these different waves, all the results we're presenting here are reweighted to be representative of the American population to account for those differential attritions. The survey was designed to assess both Americans' expressed worries and experienced shocks in 4 different domains of economic life: employment, medical cost, wealth, and family. We won't go through in great detail all the different measures in each of those domains. The employment domain included both typical measures of lost employment, but also people who were unable to work for extended periods of time, 1 month or more due to serious illness or injury. The medical domain included both lost insurance and increased costs of insurance, but also out-of-pocket medical expenses that were experienced. Wealth included both declines in housing value, stock portfolios, and loss of pension benefits and other kinds of fringe benefits. And finally, the family domain included financial assistance that was required by the extended family and various sorts of family disruptions associated with divorce or the death of a spouse or partner. The survey also incorporates 2 different measures of the impact of insecurity on Americans' lives: a measure of anxiety and a measure of unmet basic needs involving food, that is, whether people went hungry, housing, whether people lost their stable housing arrangements, and medical care, whether they went without going to the doctor for a condition they felt they needed treatment because of medical costs. Now, this aspect of the study is going to be comparative. That is, we're going to compare households with either no economic shocks to some shocks, or with limited small numbers of shocks to greater numbers of shocks, and compare, therefore, the differential level of anxiety and unmet need reported across those groups. Now, of course, those groups look different for a whole variety of different factors and in other ways. Everything we are reporting for you here today in this bivariate simplified way has been validated with multivariate models that account for income, that is baseline income, other measures of socioeconomic status like educational attainment, various measures of wealth, and the multiplicity of shocks and economic buffers that I will describe for you more in just a moment. We measure a total of about 12 different sorts of economic shocks across these 4 different domains. And it will come as no great surprise to anyone to discover that a lot of Americans between the period of spring 2008 and fall 2009 experienced a significant number of shocks, total of about 92 to 93%, depending on which weight you use, reported some sort of economic shock during that period. Now, the ubiquity of this is a little surprising, even in an economic downturn. Basically, almost every American household has been touched by some level of economic instability. Not surprisingly, given the nature of this particular recession and the extent to which it was exacerbated by disruptions of financial markets, a lot of those shocks were experienced by people to wealth, either the value of their stock holdings, their housing, or their various kinds of fringe benefits like retirement benefits. Now, this won't come as any surprise to anyone, but it's important to recognize just how unusual this one aspect of the current recession is in historical perspective. We asked people about these shocks not only in the prior time period, the last year in 2000, in the spring of 2009, the previous 6 months in the fall of 2009. But we also asked people how often they had experienced these shocks over the course of their entire adult lifetime. Just to give you some sense of perspective, 45% of our respondents indicated that they'd experienced a substantial decline in housing value in the 18 months that they were being studied here. Looking back over their entire adult lifetime, only 25% had ever reported experience that kind of substantial housing decline ever before. And so that had some unprecedented consequences that we'll return to in just a moment. For the most part, Americans' reported levels of worries and risk perceptions associated with these shocks were roughly proportional to their experience, both in aggregate and in differences across various subgroups in the population. And the extent to which these shocks are described and covered in the media and policy discourse is roughly proportional to their prevalence in this study, with three important exceptions. The first has to do with one of the shocks experienced in the employment domain, that is, people who could not go to work for extended periods of time because of illness or injury. Although it's the case that typical measures of unemployment, that is, job loss or layoffs, have significant play and significant import in policy discourse, there has been very little attention, either on the part of the public or media, to this sort of job loss, even though, as you can see, the prevalence of being too sick to work is virtually as high as the prevalence of job layoffs. Second, risk that was somewhat underrepresented is the risk that was identified in people's experience of needing to assist their extended families in some kind of way financially. About 30% of all households reported they had to make substantial financial assistance to some extended family member. Not only is this completely missed in most of the discourse on the impact of the recession on people's lives, but people in this case systematically underestimated that risk in their own assessment of the risks facing themselves. Now, conversely, they tended to significantly overestimate the risk of losing a spouse, either through divorce or death, perhaps reflecting the quite severe kind of emotional and other consequences that come with that. Probably the most single important finding of this survey has to do with the much underappreciated impact of the cumulative effect of multiple shocks on people's lives. When people experience some kind of economic disruption, it is not a once in a so often experience. It is something that tends to persist over time. Something that labor economists had identified for unemployment, that health economists had identified a bit for medical costs, but as we'll see in a moment, is ubiquitous throughout these kinds of economic disruptions. When people experience shocks, they tend to be clustered. That is, when they experience one kind of shock, they tend to experience multiple shocks in the same domain, and multiple shocks across these different domains. Let's look at the evidence in each case. So, returning to the question of the prevalence of these shocks, these are the proportion of people who experienced any shock in each of these domains. Remember, we're measuring two different points in time, spring of 2009, fall of 2009. The yellow portion of the bars indicate the proportion of people who experienced a shock at any time during these 18 months that reported experience that same shock at both different waves of the survey. And as you can see, the prevalence of persisting shocks ranges from 30 to 50%, depending on which of these different domains you're in. So it is quite common when something bad happens to people economically for that bad event to be repeated over time. Remember, this is repeated just in the subsequent 6 months. If we were doing the subsequent year, that prevalence would go up considerably. Second, when you look at shocks across the 4 different domains, and so this is a simplification of the previous graph looking just at whether people experienced any shock in the employment domain, any in the medical cost, wealth, or family domain. Of all those who experience at least one shock, which ranges from about 30% in employment to about 70% in the wealth domain, you'll see that a significant proportion experienced multiple shocks in that same domain. About 50% in the wealth domain, 40% medical costs, 30% in employment. It's only in the family domain where multiple shocks tend to be less common. Finally, and perhaps most distressingly for the households involved, when people experience shocks in one domain, they very often come with coincident shocks in other domains. So, just to take an example, if we look at our respondents who indicated they had experienced persisting unemployment across both waves of the study. It turns out that only about a quarter of them only experienced that as a persisting shock. 77% experienced persisting unemployment and at least one other persisting shock as well. Indeed, about 44% experienced persisting unemployment and at least two other persisting shocks. So that the impact is a accumulation over time, accumulation across domains, accumulation across the individual risks within a given domain. And we have to recognize that the consequences of economic security reflect that cumulative series of body blows landed on the economic life of many households. The magnitude of that impact reflects those cumulative consequences. We measure it here, as I mentioned earlier, in two different ways. By a measure of the anxiety that our respondents felt about the financial future for their household, and by a measure of the unmet needs in those three different domains that we identified earlier. Here, again, as I suggested earlier, we're going to look at things comparatively. So, assuming I can get this, I seem to be unable to get the little laser pointer to work. If you look at the far left here, what you'll see is that among households that experienced no economic shocks in the previous 18 months, about slightly less than 5% reported they were either very or extremely anxious about the economic future of their household. By contrast, if you look at households that experience shocks in any of the four different domains, you'll see that the increased prevalence of anxiety ranges from about threefold to fivefold. For households that experience persisting shocks, particularly persisting shocks in either employment, health, or family domains, there's an increase of 6 to 7-fold compared to households that experience no level of economic instability. So too, interesting. I seem to be getting the commercial overlaid on top of this. All right, so let's get rid of that. All right, this is interesting. All right, so I'm not quite sure what it is we're getting here. All right, so too, if we look at unmet needs. Of households that experience no economic shocks, about 20% reported at least one unmet need in the previous 18 months. Among those that experience shocks, particularly to the employment and healthcare domains, there is a 4 to 5-fold increase in the prevalence of unmet needs and a significant increase in the proportion of households that report multiple unmet needs, the yellow portion of the bar. There is a lesser increase associated with shocks experienced in either the wealth or the family domain, and part of this is a consequence of the overlap of shocks across these different domains. Indeed, if you look at shocks exclusive to these four domains, what you observe is that the primary impact of economic insecurity on unmet needs is felt primarily through employment and through medical spending. Households differ in their capacity to respond to these instabilities, and hence to the extent to which they experience these varying levels of anxiety or insecurity.
Louder, please.
Sorry.
The microphone.
All right, yes, sorry. So the consequences that we explored in terms of looking at households' capacity to buffer included both the financial reserves of the household itself and the capacity of the household to borrow, either through formal credit markets or various informal social networks. Here, if we start with the financial reserves that individual households report, we see a tale of two very different worlds. On the one hand, we see that about 29% of all American households report that if their income were to be stopped tomorrow, they could go 6 months or longer before experiencing financial hardship. By contrast, 28% report that they could go 1 month or less before experiencing hardship, about 20% 2 weeks or less. So we have some households that are remarkably well buffered against risks, others that are remarkably vulnerable to even short-term economic fluctuations. So too with households' capacity to borrow from their extended social networks. On the one hand, 45% of all households indicate they can borrow or they anticipate being able to borrow nothing at all from their family and friends. By contrast, about 30% report that they can borrow $10,000 or more in time of economic need. And it turns out that that capacity to draw upon one's social networks is important in the capacity to buffer against these kinds of economic instabilities. Let's illustrate by one example. What we're doing is comparing households across three different groupings, three different strata of capacity to borrow. Those that report being able to borrow $5,000 or less, $5,000 to $10,000, and $10,000 or more. And then within each of these strata, comparing households that experience no shock to those that had one shock, 2 to 3 shocks, or 4+ shocks in the previous 18 months. As you can see, among households with relatively little capacity to borrow, there is a 3 to 4-fold increase in the level of unmet need and about 7 to 8-fold increase in the level of households reporting multiple unmet needs as you move from households with no economic stability to 4+ shocks. Now, being able to borrow $5,000 to $10,000 doesn't buffer that very much. You see the same basic dose response curve. It's only when households are able to borrow $10,000 or more that you begin to get some differentiation in these growth paths. It's true that as shocks continue to increase in their prevalence, that households are not fully buffered even by the capacity to borrow large amounts of money, but there is some reduction in the level of unmet needs that they experience. Now, as we put these all together and look across the American population, you see some important commonalities and differences in terms of both risk exposure and the capacity of American households to deal with that exposure. On the one hand, although there is some differentiation by socioeconomic status in terms of how many substantial risks people are exposed to, that gradient is surprisingly shallow to the extent that even relatively well-off groups, those in the upper income quartile, those who are college educated, are still exposed to a fairly high number of economic shocks. By contrast, the buffers of the sort that we described earlier are more unevenly distributed and as a consequence tend to leave households that are vulnerable at considerable risk in the face of economic instability. The report describes a variety of different socio-demographic breakdowns in terms of comparisons of both risk exposure and capacity as buffers. We're just going to single out a couple of examples for discussion here. If, for example, one looks across various levels of educational attainment, those who've completed only high school, some college, and college graduates, you observe that, in fact, for wealth shocks, not entirely surprisingly, you actually have an inverse gradient. That is, you actually have the higher SES households being more exposed to those shocks because they're more likely to hold wealth in stocks and other kinds of volatile instruments. But even if one sets aside this increasing gradient with respect to wealth, there is, with the exception of employment, a surprisingly small gradient in terms of the risks that people report in the medical care domain or in the family domain. Meaning that although higher SES households are less exposed to the risks of an unstable economy, the reach of that instability is surprisingly broad. By contrast, there are some significant socioeconomic differences in the capacity of households to buffer against risk. And these sometimes cut in a very surprising way against our conventional understandings of more static socioeconomic disparities. For example, if we compare blacks and Latinos, each of which have on average roughly equivalent average income, you see significant differences with African Americans having significantly weaker buffers, higher levels of debt, less capacity to buffer reserves from buffer shocks from their own financial reserves, and significantly less capacity to borrow from family and friends. The combination of that, again, is to leave particular sorts of households vulnerable to these cumulative and persisting risks. Again, let's just take one example, which is to compare households with and without children. If you look at those households who've experienced no shocks, the two bars on the far left, you will see that there's a relatively small differential between those two groups in terms of either unmet basic needs or the reported levels of anxiety. As one moves to various levels of risk exposure, whether they experienced any shock at all, whether they experienced any shock that was unrelated to wealth, those differentials increase significantly. They triple to quadruple in terms of the reported levels of the differential between the two groups in terms of reported levels of unmet basic need. They double to triple in terms of the differential between those who report being very or extremely anxious about their financial future. In short, much of the disparities we observe are disparities that appear to be consequences of instability, not simply consequences of economic disadvantage. Where does that leave us? In summary, what we observe in this study is that the reach of economic instability is far broader than I think had been fully appreciated in past research or in policy discourse, that the impact of the cumulative consequences of persisting and multiple clustered shocks has a deeper and more powerful influence on household well-being. Where do we go with this in terms of policy? Let me just offer a few brief observations, and then we can open things up to the panel. First, it seems likely that if we are going to take economic insecurity more seriously as a source of both inequities and disadvantage in American populations, that we need to take equal care to think about the full range of those risks, including the risks that are typically overlooked, like the risks that are transmitted through extended families or the risks that are associated with job loss due to ill health. Second, it's absolutely essential that we recognize the multiplicity of these risks across economic domains. Virtually every policy we have to buffer against risk is domain specific, and so is in a poor position to deal with these kinds of cumulative cross-domain implications. Finally, it is perhaps most essential that we recognize that as we interpret economic statistics, we do so with an eye to the important consequences that economic insecurity have in Americans' lives. Let me take just one case in point. Americans are often chided by observers for having saved too little, the implication being they're either not being prudent or indeed being lavish in their spending and lack of foresight. But the evidence we present here presents a very different story. It suggests that households that might have been perfectly prudent in terms of putting away enough resources for the occasional rainy day may end up looking like they have no savings at all, may end up exhausting the buffers that exist within their social networks, may end up driving themselves deeply into debt, not because they didn't try to protect themselves against uncertainty, but because when uncertainty hit, it hit in cumulative, persisting, multiple ways. That rainy day turned into a rainy year, complete with mudslides, famine, and accumulation of other uncertainties that no one could be reasonably expected to protect against. And I believe it's only by understanding these multiplicity of risks will we develop an understanding and a policy apparatus that can help us give to Americans that modicum of economic security that they undoubtedly deserve. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark Schlesinger, for that very useful introduction to the study and discussion of the economic insecurities and their effects we all have to discuss. we're in a good position. We have a superbly equipped panel to discuss many of these issues. I want to say a few words of setup before turning to the panelists for their discussion and then for questions involving the audience. As Jacob Hacker said, my name is Jim Fallows from the Atlantic Monthly, and I have been involved with New America since its inception. Part of the good aspect of being here, a good news segment, is to see how this institution has blossomed in considering works like this. And both Michael Lind and Jacob Hacker, who've been here from the start, really have exemplified the kind of policy work we mean to do here. I think for Jacob, I violated my one blurb per author per lifetime rule. So I've done blurbs for 2 of your books because they've been so good. And there is a obviously more troubling aspect that this team of experts is here to help us understand, which I'll introduce with 30 seconds of sort of self-indulgent discussion. When I came back from living in China for a number of years, there were 2 things which seemed particularly worrisome about the state of America as viewed from afar and seen with somewhat new eyes. One was the increasing apparent dysfunction of our political mechanism, how we're able to turn the great resources of the country to deal with the big problems the country faces. The other is the ever more apparent polarization of America in almost any way you can think of, which is notable in the thinning out of the American middle in income distribution and opportunity and opinions and anything else. And this, I think, underscores what we've heard about the increasing vulnerability of Americans to these kinds of shocks. I'd like to start. I'll say a word about each of our panelists, just a word because you know them, and then I'll call on them for initial rounds of responses. We'll have a few minutes of discussion among the panel, and then I'll turn the floor over to all of you for questions. At the crack of 4:15, I will have to leave, even though the discussion might not be done because of a day job appointment back at the Atlantic then. But things will have a head of steam, and perhaps Michael Lind will take over as MC at that point. Let me start by calling on Larry Michel, who you all know from the Economic Policy Institute, because among his many other achievements is having this multi-year, multi-volume, multi-edition editorship of the State of Working America, which has chronicled the real conditions of Americans in various walks of life. And I'd like to ask you, Dr. Michel, as you hear this report, what is new to you, what's surprising, what is significant, and what is the main both analytical and prescriptive lesson you draw from the report we just heard?
Okay. Well, thank you very much, and let me congratulate the authors. I'm a little bit of a gimme. I've been on the advisory panel for the whole project, but hadn't seen much about this, actually, so I was very pleased to read it, and I think it's awesome work. I want to focus primarily on, as a labor market economist, on that one area of the risks in the job market, and what I think it's it's important to raise what all these different risks are. I actually think they somewhat understate the risks that people face. Let me go over that, and perhaps that's a necessary part of. You do a study and you want to capture a lot of different risks, and therefore you go kind of shallow in a particular area. So in the labor market area, and it's hard to tell. This is written for a popular audience, and so the technically minded people, kind of are looking for the deep technical appendix. So without that, this is my assessment. They talk about people being unemployed and people being hurt by not being able to work because of sickness. The unemployment, I think there's actually 2 measures, and they go back and forth. One is unemployed and one is actual job loss. The one graph I found said that around 25% of people suffered job loss over 18 months. And I was thinking, is that kind of a reasonable number? What can we benchmark that against? If you look at the period of time that the surveys cover, the average unemployment rate was 7.6%. If you know, as I do, that roughly double the amount of people are unemployed in a year that are unemployed in any particular month. So if you say 7.6 times 2 is the number, the share that would be unemployed over that, the incidence over that period of time, and then but then it's also for a year and a half. So you get up to around 22-23%. So that's pretty much dead on for that, except that this is a household incidence. So that's how much job loss occurred in your household. I'm speaking about individuals. So it's probably could be somewhat higher than that. But let me just go through. So if it's job loss, it's also true that job loss is only around 2/3 of unemployment, because all the people that are left the labor force are coming back, graduated school and coming in, are looking for work, can be unemployed, which is actually in BLS world, you're available for work, you look for work in the last 4 weeks, you're unemployed. So it may understate it for that. We also all know that there's a lot of underemployment. People are working part-time, who want a full-time job, people have dropped out of the labor force. That would almost double it. You should also know that this is survey, they're presenting the results is reasonable for the whole population, but it is really a skew. The older population has the wealth shocks, and the more younger population is having the employment shocks. So if you actually looked at this for the working age population, you would find an even deeper incidence of distress. And just to mention also that beyond that, there's people who had actual wage cuts, benefit cuts, and other kind of hour cuts. Now, I can also affirm, and then I'll stop because you're probably going to ask more than one question, Jim. I thought I was just having one bite at the apple, so I'll just do. We did a survey in September 2009 at the very same time. We asked somewhat different questions, but it reaffirms this. We said, has anyone close to you, are you close to anyone who has been laid off? We didn't actually specify in the last year, but it said 24% said someone in their household had been laid off, and another 33% said some family member or close friend had been laid off. So we also asked, this is why I'm aware of all these other things, are you close to anyone who had hours or pay cuts? And 37% said they had someone with an hours cut or a pay cut, and 24% said a family member or a close friend had pay cuts. So I don't know, so it seems like this is, they're onto something really important, and it may actually be the tip of the iceberg in terms of actually judging the incidents. How that plays into the insecurities, I'm not so sure.
Great. Continuing with a relatively brief round of opening statements here, I wanted to ask Ezra Klein, who you all know from his Wonk Book blog at the Post, which has really pioneered a way of having informed, timely analysis of policy that I think he's gotten a lot of deserved credit for personally. I'm going to ask you this, Ezra. You have covered a lot of the politics and policy of the last now 2 years as an administration has come in determined as in a stated way to deal with a lot of economic insecurities, a lot of economic challenges. As you see the results of this survey, how do you match them to the politics and the policies of the last 2 years? What problems do you think are being addressed? Which ones are not?
Thanks, Jim. And I think the way to put it is that this survey gives a little bit of an organizing theory to initiatives that this administration, despite the considerable rhetorical talents of some of its members, has not always been so good at articulating. I think if you were going to put this survey very simply, you'd say we're seeing an increase in risk. I think that's been a long-time theme in Jacob's work, and I think you're seeing it here. And one of the things you often see in commentary, sometimes from people at this institution and sometimes from people at my institution, is that there's sort of a theory that government should follow the private sector in certain ways. If there is more risk, if the private sector appears to be believing that more risk in things like pensions, moving from defined benefit to defined contribution is better, more risk in things like healthcare, moving from traditional insurance arrangements to more high deductible consumer-oriented care. If those are the way things are going, then maybe government should take a line from the private sector and see that those work better and begin thinking about moving more private accounts into Social Security or changing the way Medicare and Medicaid run. And I'd say that this makes a case for the opposite, and it's a case that the administration, I think, buys into, but hasn't done a very, very good job of articulating, which is that there's an extraordinary amount of risk out there for the average American. And that has all the nasty consequences we see in the survey, people losing their jobs and being unable to meet basic needs. But it also does something else, which I think goes to Jim's points about China. If you're part of a family that last year got wiped out for reasons that weren't really under your control, somebody got a terrible medical illness, and shortly before that, your factory had gone bankrupt, so you lost your health care insurance, your level of risk-taking from that point on is likely to be substantially depressed. you are not going to be someone who wants to sacrifice a decent paying, fairly stable job at a big firm for the unexpected risks and opportunities of entrepreneurship. And so one of the things that I think we see in a survey like this is that in order to encourage the types of risks we do want, risks in the capital market, risks in the business markets and risks as individuals, sometimes we need a force capable of leaning against those that we don't want. Family losing their house because of medical costs or losing their job because of a global financial crisis. And the administration has done an okay job on this. In particular, the healthcare reform bill, if and when it does go into effect, does a very good job on cost protection. If this bill is going to affect very, very few people who have gigantic medical discretionary spending shocks, certainly compared to the situation now, although that doesn't get, I think, talked about quite enough. But certainly there's more to do, and I think there's more to do in creating sort of an organizing theory about this. I think the feeling that government is now trying to stamp out risks is wrong, that I think correctly understood the right relationship between a private sector, which gives rise to this sort of risk, and a government which can do something to tamp it down, is to bring down some of the risks that we don't want in society in order to make it more plausible for people to take the risks that we do want them to be able to take.
Great, thank you very much. And let me just use your admirable brevity to add one extension of your point about risk in China. People from outside often wonder why the Chinese populace is not clamoring more broadly for open democratic systems and all the other sort of turmoil of competitive politics. If the political history of the country over the last century has been sort of one unrelieved disaster after another, risk and chaos and rapid change is often associated with things which want to be avoided. So there's a sort of national level manifestation of what you're talking about, the family level too. Let me turn now to Stuart Butler, whom you all know from the Heritage Foundation, who in great good spirit over many years often appears at forums like this in this role to provide a constructive, conservative, skeptical of the state role in an audience that he suspects is leading the other way. So as you hear about increased risk, increased inequality of result in the American population, what's your perspective on these findings and their implications?
Well, let me just say, first of all, it is nice to be here and to be in this kind of audience. I always feel that I'm the sort of kumbaya conservative on this, so I will take it in good faith. First of all, let me just say, as others have said, I just want to compliment Jacob and Mark on this work, on the whole work, not just this survey. I think they've added immeasurably to our understanding of the issues associated with risk and with how that plays into public policy. And I certainly, whilst I may disagree in some areas with some aspects of this, I think this is extremely important. It's an extremely important dimension of the whole discussion that should take place, and is unfortunately, I think, has not been as full a part of the conversation on both sides of the aisle, really, certainly on the conservative side of the aisle, for too long. So I just want to sort of make that point very clearly. I think when I look at it, first of all, let me just say that I think, to pick up on what Ezra just said, that when you look at how people respond to instability and insecurity, it's fair to say, I think, that left to their own devices, as it were, sometimes they respond in ways that may in the long term not be beneficial to dealing with those risks. And some of those are kind of paradoxical. We see right now, for example, since before the recession, we now see a doubling of the personal savings rate in this country. And we have people kind of, wringing their hands saying, why aren't people spending and getting us back to work and getting jobs? We see businesses responding to uncertainty by building up huge cash reserves. They're not building factories. Mm-hmm. So sort of responses can be problematic. Even if you look at the tendency also, when things are unstable, you tend to have an approach of trying to block or resist changes that are occurring generally in the economy. And I think that's very important. Resistance to industrial change. If we're seeing an economy that needs to restructure, it's very difficult to get people to be accepting of that in a period of high unemployment or certainly high risk. And similarly, when we're looking even at the programs that are designed to provide assistance or insurance in some way, even that can be an issue. Because maybe, and one of the points I wanted to make very strongly is that when you look at these implications and you start thinking about the future of social insurance, it seems to me that in general one would want to move those programs more and more towards programs that more fully deal with unexpected change, with risk, in other words, what I would call real insurance, rather than programs that give you a stream of predictable benefits in the future or in certain situations. And I think it has lots of implications for the debate over social insurance, over Medicare, over and so on. So I think the challenge, when you are looking at this, is to think of stabilizers or buffers, as Mark called them, that sort of have good long-term effects and not unintended effects that don't undermine economic growth in the future. I think the whole debate right now over whether there should be a tax measure in the next day or so that preserves something for the next 2 years, or should provide a much more longer-term, permanent sort of tax picture so that businesses and individuals can respond. I know that's not really on the table even.
Yes, and we'll stipulate we're not going to discuss the tax cuts.
No, but I think it's. I don't want to dwell on it either. But I think it's just illustrative. I think of this issue of how do you get stabilized, and we don't want to shift. We don't want to take measures to deal with the existing population and existing working populations in such a way that it actually adds to longer-term risk for future generations. If you build up greater instability because of debt, for example, that can pose all kinds of uncertainties about the viability of programs, including programs intended to limit risk in the future. So this whole issue of how we think about the long-term fiscal picture is all wound up, I think, in the findings of this study.
Great, thank you. So we've actually had a very nice progression here. Larry Michel was talking about risk and uncertainty in the labor market as being sort of the prime mover here. Klein was suggesting a way to think about containing certain kinds of risks so that people can be free to take others. And then Stuart Butler was talking about ways to think about the right and wrong kind of buffers and stabilizers. I'd like, as part of this first round, to turn to our two presenters to ask them to give us the clearest possible explanations of two things. One is why this happened. What's the main reason there is so much more uncertainty and risk? I know you could answer that in 2-hour form, but give us the 30-second form of it. And what should be done? How is you're in this stream of logic? We're saying, okay, what kind of buffers work? What kinds don't? How can we expose people to the right kind of risk? Your answers, as you divide them as you see fit between the two of you.
Since I wrote a book on what's happened and why,
a very good book.
The Great Risk Shift, I'll take the first part of that question, thus leaving Mark with the unenviable task of speaking to the policy implications. But to my mind, there are basically two reasons why we've seen this rise in risk. And I want to emphasize up front that it's not, the period we're looking at is clearly a period of extreme uncertainty, insecurity, hardship. But it's not as unusual as you might think. On a lot of the measures of worry we find and concern about risks, because we matched this 2007 Rockefeller survey and because we were able to draw on the Kaiser Foundation's tracking surveys, we were able to show that for employment risk, clearly there was a big increase. For general concerns about one's economic security, which seemed to very closely track employment concerns, there was a big increase. But that medical cost concerns and health insurance concerns rose, but were relatively similar during the downturn than they were prior to it. And the same was true of concerns about family risks. I will say one thing there is just looking forward, that as I hinted in my opening, that we have seen very little decline in many of these measures. And given what we know about the way the labor market is right now and the fears we have about its long-term trajectory, I think we're going to see elevated levels of economic risk, such as we find here, for some time to come. So there is a deeper story here about the long-term rise. And I'll just say briefly, I think it reflects both changes in the overall economy that have increased exposure to risk for workers previously well insulated from them, and you've heard these stories about the changes in technology and global competition. But the other side of this is the United States was uniquely dependent upon employers to play a kind of buffering function through health insurance and defined benefit retirement pensions, through essentially employment implicit or explicit employment contracts that internalize some of the risks of job loss or skill displacement, all of that has been seriously eroded. And Ezra's written eloquently about that on his blog, and Stuart has written well about it in his proposals. Just take health insurance, right? The share of Americans getting health insurance from their own employer has plummeted. And regardless of the effect of the Accountable Care Act on employers' willingness to offer coverage, we're going to see that trend probably continue. And so we're more and more finding that Americans are dealing with those risks on their own rather than through the broad pooling of risks through the workplace. And the public sector, while it's picked up some of the slack, we've actually seen a big expansion of some areas, is not done so enough to offset that change. So, Mark, you can tell us what we should do now.
Yeah. Well, the one thing that we clearly need to do, and this follows on the comments of all three panelists, is to think about what as a aspiration for society we have for the optimal level of risk, whether this is Ezra's notion of risk trade-offs or Larry's notion of risks that were missed in the survey. The fundamental purpose of any collective enterprise is decide how to strike a balance. The challenge that's posed by this report to that seemingly reasonable and not that complex goal is that when we look across all these different domains, risks matter differently to people. And this will come as no surprise to those of you who know the psychology of risk. Risks matter more if people think the consequences are longer lasting, so people worry about losing their spouse a lot more than they worry about losing their job. Risks matter more to people if they're unpredictable, if they can't anticipate them in some way. And so people worry a lot more about risks associated with medical care than they worry about risks of retirement income. Somehow, if we're going to construct this balance, this appropriate level of risk, we need a way of accumulating, of accounting, of deciding how much aggregate risk we are facing, and then how much aggregate risk we want to be facing.
To ask another quick round of questions of everybody, then I'll turn it over to the audience. I want to ask Larry Michel, following the theme of the importance of employment risk and the different ways that people perceive it in today's American political surroundings. What's the most advanced proposal you could make for a way to buffer the risk in the employment market?
Good question. Well, I think the main risks that we may not be dealing adequately with, where I thought we needed to make progress. One, we're making some progress on the healthcare. The other is retirement. We are going full speed ahead in dismantling retirement security because we've already dismantling the employer-based system. People lost their wealth, and this year we're seeing bipartisan attacks on Social Security benefits, in my view. So we're moving massively the other direction. We're also massively moving against things like support for housing and training. If you note that the Bowles-Simpson proposals really propose cutting domestic spending by 40% relative to GDP over the next 10 years. So it's hard to see much support going. I mean, what the report is recommending is thinking a new way, but we are going pell-mell the other direction. And so we're not living in an alternative universe talking here, and I just thought I'd point that out.
Right. And so Ezra, just following on that, you again are very close to the operational politics and policy of these issues. How do you see the risk debate? Is it going to just degenerate into trench warfare for these next 2 years? Do you see any sign of the Democrats being able to recast it, the Republicans embracing any part of it?
Oh, I wouldn't use the word debate for what's going to happen over the next 2 years. I would sadly not take issue with Larry. I just don't see a lot happening in one direction or another. I don't see major moves to tamp down on risks. And I also, despite the flurry of reports in town lately, I did a roundup of deficit reports the other day and came up with 10, which is more reports than I think we frankly need to reduce the deficit. I do not really anticipate major action happening on that front either. So I think that for the next couple of years we're going to be in a place of a bit of gridlock and stalemate. And it made me think of something on your previous question, Jim, about what sort of what policies you would propose. I think when people talk about policy, they don't think enough about how you would reform how you pass policies. And I think that we need to look at not only the next years, but years going forward, and look at things like the rise of the filibuster and wonder, if you think that the problems you're worried about now, things like risk, are going to become more and more prevalent, whether or not one of the things you might want to begin thinking about is the capacity of the political system to respond to new challenges, which appears to me, and I think to some others, as you've written about, to be somewhat deteriorated, and to be a more significant challenge here than actually the abstract evidence and debates about the issue. I don't think the question of risk and American concern over it is all that controversial. I do think the question of whether or not anything can be done about it is much more substantial.
I will say I depressingly agree with you on that observation. Let me now again go down the line to ask Stuart Butler, not a partisan, but about you are here as our reasonable conservative representative. Is there a way?
This is the New America Foundation.
Yes, it is.
Cap,
Now, in the real politics of modern America, can you imagine the Republican Party taking seriously the issue of risk, and how would you drive the Republican Party towards that end of taking seriously the issue of risk?
Well, let me just state, I don't speak for the Republican Party at all. I'm not actually a member of it. Yeah. But I do think it is important, and I take Ezra's point about being pessimistic about the ability of the political system right now to deal with it. And I don't feel quite the same way about his concern about too many proposals coming out. I think this is a good stage in what needs to happen. I do think there needs to be much more conversation about these issues. And I think the further it gets away from very specific legislative proposals to go into place now, and gets much more into really getting to grips with the deeper issues involved, the more likely both sides are going to be able to agree sufficiently on how to move forward. And as I said in my opening comments, I think the great contribution of this is to push more strongly into the public conversation the idea of risk, because I do think that there are many people, many of my friends on the right, who sort of look at a lot of these issues in very technical ways and sort of in a sense logical ways, and don't actually sort of appreciate how people's worry about insecurity and risk, things that you saw here, how they respond to that, will affect their willingness to countenance proposals for change. I think that's what we've really got to get to grips with and kind of understand all that. As Jacob mentioned, I think in areas like whether or not we should, in the future, be dependent upon employers, and Larry said the same thing, for very fundamental buffers, absolutely should be discussed more thoroughly. And I think there's a real opportunity to move in the right direction. I favor moving to a health system which is separate from the place of work in terms of that. I think that's widely felt, if not fully articulated by everybody, but it's certainly a feeling that is strongly held. And I think there are other areas. I've mentioned another one, to start to rethink, and I push my friends on the left to do this, to start to be open to a reconsideration of what the purposes are of these large social insurance programs. I want to see them more progressive, because I do think, if you think about it as programs like Medicare and Social Security and other support programs should be more designed to deal with unpredictable, large changes and disruptions, the more you would want to redesign those programs to focus on giving a much greater support for those kinds of unexpected situations, and less for the same dollars for the long term. But then you propose that, and people start saying, you just want to turn it all into welfare. Well, I guess that you could argue that, but the fact is, it's talking about turning it turning these programs into systems that can in fact help people withstand the very shocks that the two authors have talked about and have said are so important.
A panel-wide toss-up question, then I'll turn to all of you for questions. What is the area where you can most imagine actual accord between the various sides in modern politics on a risk buffering, risk prevention measure? If that were our goal, what would we start proposing?
Well, I'm curious to see where Larry will come down on this, but I would say the job market risks that we're seeing right now are an area where there should be grounds for common agreement in two respects. One is that right now what we're facing essentially is a severe job shortage, right? So unemployment insurance is basically there to help keep people above water when they're out of the workforce. Over the longer term, what we've seen in recent decades is a growing problem of skilled displacement, where people are needing to, who lose a job, are really moving from one area of the economy to another, and we as a society have not really invested in trying to help people with the kind of tools they need to make those transitions. It seems to me that, while there is some disagreement about the degree to which we should be providing wage supplements, for example, or retraining and how that works, that's an area where there may be common ground. But that common ground will only occur, I think, in a context in which we have a reasonably strong job market. And so I think where the fight is right now is not about how do we deal with the risk, but how do we reduce the level of risk right now in the labor market? And I know Larry's thought a lot about that, but that would be the area where I see common ground. Right now, for healthcare is so tied up in partisan politics, I think it's striking how little people are willing to discuss the risks that attend to family life. And we, at least I'm speaking for myself here, as always when I talk about policies, but I'm very deeply concerned about retirement security and the future of the housing sector and the high levels of mortgage foreclosure, but preventing wealth losses in general is not my highest priority. So,
I might mention two where I think there is a possibility. One is the whole area of savings, and I take Mark's point well that the level of savings and the buffer of savings, particularly among most vulnerable population, is so small now that it's wiped out so quickly that it is almost of no effect. But there's a lot of interest, including here, Ray Bashara here at the New America Foundation, about the importance of looking at choice architecture in the area of savings to change the defaults and so on, to look at ways of matching, other ways of helping people to build a much bigger and more solid stability through savings in the future. I think that's one. I think a second, and this is kind of more longer haul, I think there is a broad agreement in this country by almost everybody, I think, and certainly everybody who deals with policy questions, that when you look at the education system as it serves, which is hardly the word to use, as it serves the most vulnerable populations, it is totally dysfunctional. And we are not going to be able to have people who are adaptive, able to change with the changing economy, having the basic skills, if we don't overhaul our public school system in this country. It is a failing institution, and I think I think that's broadly agreed. There may be different arguments about exactly what you do about it, but I think that's a critical element in building long-term stability for the most vulnerable population.
Great. So I will turn to the audience unless any of you, Larry, yes.
Well, I guess I'm in a much more sour mood than the other people. But I want to voice it. We just had 18, 19 months of unemployment above 9%. And I think the punditry, the powerful interests in our society have a studied indifference. So, I didn't see much energy coming from the administration in the last year to do much about jobs. I think the conservative proposals, they don't actually believe in doing anything about jobs in the short run. They believe about long run growth programs. So they're not really, and even the protections like unemployment insurance, they try to blame that for high unemployment. And I seem to be pretty indifferent about even maintaining that. So the idea of people getting together to insure against risk, it's like people talking about the crisis we may have because of deficits when ignoring the crisis that we actually are experiencing. I have a hard time getting over that.
I'll just add one quick thought to that, which is one of the difficulties of this conversation. I think it's been a difficulty in Washington throughout the recession. Is it is very, very difficult, I think, to overstate the degree to which this is not a Washington recession, and in some ways, it is. When I read these surveys, and I remember reading stuff from Larry's outfit about the number of households that have had direct experience with the job loss, and I remember as being more than half. I mean, there's some remarkable number. Not that there was one in there, but them or a family member, someone quite close, and there's more than half. And the degree that folks in Washington are experiencing a fairly good economy right now, Washington and the surrounding areas, I really do believe it creates a problem. And I'll just add one thing. When Jim asked about whether or not there'd be agreement on a risk-reducing policy, I think sort of the opposite. I think that there's a not inconsiderable chance that we'll see some sort of bipartisan action on Social Security. And what always really strikes me about the Social Security conversation in this town is that a lot of people in my line of work who you're going to have to take out of their jobs on a stretcher are very, very excited about raising the retirement age, but very, very unexcited about raising the tax cap. So the thing that they would not do, which is retire at 65, and remember the average American retires at 62 and not 65 because they want to stop working, they're very, very excited to make that harder to do. But when it comes to costs they would pay directly, which is increasing the amount of earnings that the Social Security payroll tax would affect, there's very little support for it in this town. And so it always sort of makes you feel like a skunk at the party here to say that perhaps the lived experiences of people who hold power matter for policy. Of course, we're all sort of platonic idealists, and we only make policy based on the best evidence and for the good of the people. But it is hard sometimes when I look at the way, as Larry says, the jobs and deficit crises are treated, and then the different ways to fix Social Security are treated, to escape the conclusion that perhaps there is a bit of a bias based on the way people in this town live their lives as to what policy actually gets done. And I don't think that points in a great direction for risk, because I don't think this is a town that is finding itself in a particularly risky position.
Can I say that's in direct, what Ezra is saying, what the conventional wisdom is in direct contradiction to what actual polls say. Yes. Polls uniformly, the most popular tax you can raise is raising the cap on Social Security.
But actually, consistently,
and people are consistently against raising the retirement age.
Right.
But walk around this town and you think it's the opposite.
Yes, here, please stand up, identify yourself, and yes. Are there microphones? Okay, yes, the microphone will come to you.
I'm Dr. Caroline Poplin. I'm a primary care physician. My question is a follow-on to what the last two of you just said, and there's no evidence in anything you've presented that this tremendous anxiety and these problems are caused by too much government or too much government spending. Yet we just had an election in which the Republicans won a smashing victory on apparently that argument, that the problem is too much government and too much government spending. I'm older than most of you, and this is a sea change from the way things were in the 1960s. On public television last night, there was a 2-hour special on Hubert Humphrey. Why? How do you go from what the situation is to what the rest of the country, their response?
Anybody would like to answer that? Or
Jacob just wrote a book on this, I think.
Beg your pardon?
Jacob just wrote a book on
exactly,
this, I think.
Yes. About, and you can give the condensed version of your pitch.
Right. The very condensed version would be you can read the book, but I'll put on my take off my Rockefeller Foundation supported academic hat and put on my just wrote a book on inequality in American politics hat, and just say that I think you want to be careful not to overinterpret the Republicans' victory as just an indictment of government spending or overreach. If you look at the poll results then and now, and as well as the biased turnout, which is normal in midterm elections, I think the one thing that's quite clear is just a huge amount of anxiety and anger that was well explained by some of our findings, directed interestingly and continuing to be directed interestingly toward Wall Street and towards the groups that Americans think are getting a good deal in this terrible economy. And their sense is that the administration and Democrats are not that far apart from Republicans in this crucial respect. And I'll just give two telling statistics on this. One is that when you ask people, the Pew Research Center asked people who's been helped by government a great deal, 53% of respondents said Wall Street, 44% said corporate America. Does anybody hazard to guess what percentage say the middle class have been helped a great deal?
15%.
2%. So that's not, I mean, I joke that you can get people to agree to almost 2% of people to agree to almost anything. In this case, you could hardly get 2% to agree to the middle class was being helped. The other poll is just, the exit polls showed that people blamed in this order Wall Street, President Bush, and President Obama for the economic crisis. But of those who blamed Wall Street, the 2/3 majority voted for Republicans. And I think that just is suggestive of the degree to which people are not necessarily, they're directing their anger at the incumbent party, and it will actually, I think, create some tensions for Republicans going forward, in the sense that I think a lot of these anxieties are not going to be easily addressed by either party without some serious effort to try to get the economy going again. So now I can put back on my academic hat.
So I'll take another question. Yes, Stuart.
Well, I would just say, I mean, and I'm speaking, I guess, to you, I mean, in terms of people who think that the scale of government is either about right or should be slightly larger, that I think the way to look at the election in large part is to say, well, people looked at government and they came to certain conclusions. One is that they thought, never mind the scale of government, but it was getting involved in things that they really felt uncomfortable with. And I think that the debate over the healthcare legislation precisely is that. I think, secondly, on widespread, they looked at C-SPAN, well, maybe not C-SPAN, read the papers and sort of saw what was going on in Washington and really didn't like it and wanted less of that. I think, and then thirdly, in relation to the first two, I think they look at government and they say, is it worth the money that we're paying? It's a very practical kind of view that, we spend all this money, it's this large, we spend these time, we still get a recession, and we still get banks collapsing and so on. So, there's something wrong with this, and I'm going to vote against it. I think that's very important to understand, because if you ignore that, it seems to me it's going to be very hard to articulate a vision of the appropriate government role if people still retain those visions of government.
Yes. Yes, sir. Did you have your hand up? Yes. Okay. And then I'll go back.
Yeah, Church and freelance correspondent, Bethesda, Maryland. I think basic is the employment problem. Both Germany and China, they have same policy. They don't want to lay out the people, and they don't fire the people, and everybody share. And now the private industry run ahead of Obama. The result just published. Last 5 years, U.S. outsourcing, 60% went to India. India is a very bright big hole for the outsourcing. So I think the problem will be increased because more outsourcing, less employment. I think basically the outsourcing problem have to deal with. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody like to respond to that? I'll say something about, there were actually a lot of layoffs in China over these last 2 or 3 years, but then a lot of big public employment programs to cut, the people who had lost their jobs in Shenzhen, they found ways to employ.
But that's the outside countries.
Yeah. Yes. Anybody want to respond to that? Okay. Thank you very much. Yes, back there on the aisle. Yes, gentlemen. And this will be the time for Michael Lynn to come up here, and we'll have a. So,
thank you, Jim.
Thank you all.
Zoom change.
Greg Squires, George Washington University. Question is this: I think it's a lot easier to come up with ideas that could probably address many of these security issues. The greater challenge is coming up with the political strategies that will enable us to implement those ideas that could work. Jacob, I read your book, and I think you're absolutely right in saying it's largely politics that created the winner-take-all society and not economics, globalization, and so forth. But what we need, I think, is as much a discussion of what are the strategies that will enable us to actually implement some of these programmatic ideas that might work.
Well, I mean, I agree, of course, and I think Ezra actually started that conversation by saying, we really have to look at aspects of our political system that make it hard to address these problems, and 2 of them have come up already. One is the institutional sclerosis of our government. I think there's important respects in which our current era is parallel to the early 20th century, when it seemed as if government was sort of way behind the private sector. Sometimes that seems like a good thing. when you see big what are called financial innovations or Silicon Valley doing well. But in other times, as it is now, it seems like a terrible thing. The government is so far behind. It's acting so slowly and letting these developments proceed without any oversight or any influence from democratic politics. And I think the filibuster is a big part of that. It's become a routinized part of our politics in a way that it wasn't prior to the last 15 or 20 years. The other side of this, I think, of thinking about political that's come up, it's worth emphasizing and maybe taking the point that Ezra did a little higher, is that we've seen, I think, a decline in responsiveness to at least the economic concerns of middle-class Americans in our political system. And these strains and problems are ones that are battering middle-class America. I mean, David Brooks and Paul Krugman could at least agree on that. If you read David Brooks' latest column on the, creating, sort of cultivating middle-class virtues. And, just it's very hard to see our idea of the middle class enduring if the middle class is feeling this uncertain and this unstable. But it does seem as if our political system is not capable of responding in a kind of cumulative, effective way to these concerns in ways that sometimes mean flouting public opinion temporarily, but responding to sort of the deeper economic concerns that Americans are having. And I'll just say on that, on that front, I don't think you can understate the extent to which this is reflective of changes in the associational life of America, the decline in the kind of organizations that once brought people into politics and helped inform them of their interest. And I will mention that one of these groups that rarely gets mentioned at these fora, but it's quite important, is labor unions. The decline of labor unions, I think, is a big part of the story.
I want to jump in on this because one of the actors I don't think you pointed out, but I think is huge, is the power of business, which whenever you're talking about, really, the politics of the last 30 years has primarily been about revenues, right? First cut revenues, limit government, et cetera, which is about, those people who have the money, don't want to pay anymore, have a politics about that, and doing a lot of things to deal with the stability of family life and paid sick leave or unemployment insurance or workers' comp or all different sorts of things involve money and involve things that business doesn't like. And business has a hold on at least 1.5 of the two parties that we have in this country. And therefore you find that it's really hard to incubate a set of policies that people, I think, will actually protect people in terms of their economic security.
We have about 10 minutes. We'll take 3 more questions sequentially and then have a final response by the panelists. So please make these questions, not statements. The microphone will come to you. Yes.
Hi, I'm Mo Tasic. I'm a journalist. Sometimes with these things, I feel like I hear a lot about this sort of cognitive problem that we have in Washington where we don't really feel the recession. To what extent, and this kind of goes to the labor problem too, and the kind of diminishing of their voice, to what extent do you think, I just moved here from New York, and I was I was sort of amused to find one of the first headlines when I moved down here was that, we have 7 out of 10 of the richest counties in our area. But that's based on median household income, not mean household income. We are not by any stretch rich in Washington. I mean, I think that part of the problem is that we don't have enough inequality here. We don't have billionaires. We don't have really, really despicable wealthy people that can serve as our enemy, because that is who the government, the people, there is only one institution that is going to curb their power.
Could you please formulate this as a question?
Sorry, I'm wondering, to what extent do you think that that might be our problem?
Okay. Next question. Shane? Second row up here.
Hi, I'm Nancy Donaldson. I'm the head of the ILO office in Washington, International Labor Organization. And so I can't help but listen to this panel in the context of the many events I'm covering that have to do with the international statistics, particularly at the IMF. And the question that I would want to say, well, the most dramatic thing that I've heard there in the last couple months is a very powerful modeling analysis about the relationship of inequality to the likelihood of future shocks at a macroeconomic level, and exactly where that comes in. And specifically, one of their conclusions is the decline in collective bargaining power worldwide, which relates to labor unions, but is not only that. And so I just might ask you one thing that we at the ILO know very well is that employment challenges, unemployment is different in different places in the world. And the most challenged places are the developed countries like the US right now, not the developing countries on this problem. So to the extent that you can relate your thinking about this to this larger question about the global relationship, which some of you have mentioned, it would be welcome.
Nancy. Yes, there was a hand in the middle back there.
I didn't quite hear the last question, but I think this may build on it. I read we hear this statistic quite frequently that the top 1% of earners earn something like 25% or 40% of the wealth, or I forget, you guys must know what this is. Anyway, it's very disproportionate that top income earners have a disproportionate amount of the total wealth. But if this were to be redistributed, and I understand there's a huge political problem with doing that, but if it were to be redistributed, given the global economic situation, is there enough wealth, is there enough GNP in the country now to deal with all the risk? In other words, if it were possible to somehow redistribute it. Or are we in a position now in the history of the global economy that the U.S. is no longer in a position to be able to provide welfare for a decent welfare state for everybody?
Thank you for those questions. We'll begin with Dr. Michel.
Yeah, thanks. Well, I'll answer the last one. So this is we have had over the last 15 years some of the fastest productivity growth, the fastest expansion of the pie that we've seen in the post-war period. And in the period from 1979 to right before the recession, there was a growth of productivity about 80%. So you can imagine that almost every person could be 80% better off. And if you actually look at what happened, that obviously didn't happen. And so let's even look at that going forward. I think it's really important because, per capita income or any measure of wealth, if you get a projection between now and 2020 or 2035, we will be, on average, richer, wealthier. But the politics going on right now is as if we can't afford anything. Well, the question is, who is we?
Mr. Klein.
I don't know too much about international bargaining, so I would answer your question if I could, but I don't think I have a great take on it. The question about whether or not redistributing the gains at the sort of top 1% would get us to an adequate welfare state, it's just sort of, I think, depends on what you think an adequate welfare state is. I mean, there's money there, but it'd be difficult to do it. And the problem that I think we're having is that people haven't come up with great ways to deal with pre-tax inequality yet. What you could do is you could vastly increase the post-tax, or you could vastly decrease post-tax inequality, right? It could be the case that, yeah, you can be a financial billionaire and make, and a sort of a hedge fund king, but unfortunately, at the end of the day, you got to pay a bunch of money back to the Treasury, and that money goes out through social programs. I think as we're seeing right now in the in the tax debate, that doesn't seem to be an incredibly popular position. The cost of sort of anything for the middle class has been enormous cuts for the rich, and I think you can make a good case for that on stimulus grounds given the available options, but there's some pretty crummy options. And that, I think, goes to Mo's point, which is that there doesn't seem to be the resentment coming out of this that one would expect. The Post did a poll yesterday looking at the different components of the tax deal, and Jim said we weren't going to discuss it, but he's gone now, so I can talk about it. And getting rid of the estate tax for the next 2 years, essentially getting rid of it, so that it would only affect 6,600 or some very small number of estates, is wildly popular. People really hate the idea that the estates of extremely rich Americans might be at all taxed. Meanwhile, what's very unpopular is the payroll tax cut, which is the thing that's probably going to help most Americans. Now, maybe that's because they see it as related to Social Security, as harming Social Security. But whatever's going on, the tax cuts, though the tax cuts for the rich are not on their own popular, there is not the sort of public outrage you might anticipate at this deal. And there, in general, there's a pretty wide acceptance of very low tax rates for very, very wealthy Americans. So I do think that one of the social funding problems we're having here is that you may be able to make an argument for somewhat higher tax rates, but the politics don't at this point seem to exist for vastly higher tax rates on the rich. And Democrats are much, much, much too afraid of the issue to try to move the needle on that. And so until one of those two things changes, either Democrats decide to try to lead on that or the public decides to lead on it for them, it's hard to see where that money comes from, much as how it gets moved around.
Dr. Butler.
I think we could have a very lengthy debate, maybe should at some other point, about the issue of equality and inequality in terms of wealth and earnings. But I actually do think that that's much more a parallel, separate issue than what we've actually been talking about for most of the time, because I do feel that simply looking at getting greater equality of income is not going to address the fundamental things that this survey was illustrating. It's not going to affect, in my view, at least the instability, the disruption, and so on. I think there's actually much more interesting correlation between thinking about what you do to get buffers and stability against insecurity, and a lot of the work that's being done by a lot of organizations, including New America Foundation through the Pew Foundation, about economic mobility. In other words, the link between uncertainty and risk, and the issue of how do you create conditions where it's more likely that people will move up the economic ladder. And I think when you look at both of those, in my view, the solutions, the kinds of ideas that fit both of those issues are very similar. It is things like the education system. It is things like the stability of families. It is things like the savings rate, and so on. That seems to be much more of a key. So I think it's a sort of whilst it's a legitimate issue to look at, I think it gets you down a false road to start thinking about this as an income inequality issue when you think about instability. It's much more important to think about it in the context of addressing instability head-on, and also addressing the issues that make it more likely that people who are stuck at the bottom are perpetually more vulnerable, actually have a better chance of moving up the economic ladder because of steps you take to make them, to improve their personal capital, social capital, financial capital, to be much more likely to be upwardly mobile.
Dr. Schlesinger.
There's two competing conceptions about the politics of insecurity that we've heard floating about the room today, both of which have to do with constructing coalitions between those who face insecurity and those who aspire to other sorts of outcomes. So on the one hand, we have the coalition of the insecure and the potentially upwardly mobile, and that possible linkage. On the other hand, there is a plausible connection, even though insecurity and inequality are only somewhat correlated. There is a plausible political correlation between those two groups as well. And indeed, Jacob and Philip and I, in separate work, are exploring what we call the coalitions of suffering and the extent to which those can provide a resilient political base for the welfare state cross-nationally. I think it remains an open question which of those two options represents the most constructive way of bringing insecurity into the mainstream of American political discourse. Possibly both will be experimented with. We'll see which wins out.
Dr. Hacker?
Well, I'd just like to thank everyone again for coming, and all of you for this really stimulating conversation. And my clothing thought is, well, I always have more than one, I guess. But here, my clothing thought is that we could deal with a lot of our financial problems by having a deficit report tax, Ezra. So that would help. And on the question of whether or not we can afford a welfare state that provides a basic level of economic security, I think if we can deal with rising healthcare costs, I think there's no question that we can provide that. I mean, we should know that. We should recognize, however, as I pointed out before, that it's our system is still very reliant on the private sector and employers, and that's going to erode, and that's going to create pressure to put more onto the public sector, and we have a relatively small system of public sector economic support and security compared with other rich democracies. The question I think really that's before us as we look forward is whether or not we can have the kind of society we want where we see not only great inequalities, but those inequalities being highly associated with deep vulnerability to economic shocks. And maybe the Ezra calls on us to think a little bit about pre-tax inequality, and I think that's right. And for the record, in 2007, the top 1% before taxes had 23.5% of national income. The question is, could we affect that? And I think one area where it's ripe for being affected is the way in which we regulate financial markets and to a lesser extent, but important extent, corporate compensation. And yes, I think that's clearly a place to look. But let me say another thing, which may run against the grain of my general MO on issues of inequality, is that I would be less concerned about whether there are vast inequalities of income if they didn't, as they do today, translate into vast inequalities in both exposure to and protection against economic risk. And I think we could at least reach greater agreement, and I know Stuart would second me here, and since he doesn't have a chance to talk, I'm going to say he would, in saying that he too would aspire to a society in which the issue is not whether you're rich or poor, but whether you both have a meaningful chance of climbing the economic ladder and are protected against the gravest risks of falling down it.
The report is Standing on Shaky Ground, Americans' Experiences with Economic Security by Jacob Hacker, Philip Ream, Mark Schlesinger. I'd like to thank our panelists, Dr. Larry Michel, Ezra Klein, and Dr. Stuart Butler, as well as two of the three authors, as well as the third, Philip Ream. Please join me in thanking both the authors and the panelists.